I'd been living in apartment 4B for 3 years when everything changed. My life was simple back then. Wake up, make coffee, sit at my desk, and work on design projects until the sun went down. I was a freelance graphic designer, which meant I spent most of my time alone in my apartment, and honestly, I liked it that way. No office drama, no forced small talk by the water cooler, just me and my work. The apartment building was old but decent, the kind of place where people minded their own business. I'd see neighbors in the hallway sometimes, we'd nod at each other, maybe say good morning, and that was it. Perfect for someone like me who valued their peace and quiet. Then she moved in. It was late August when I first saw her. I was heading out to grab some groceries, and there she was, standing in the doorway of apartment 4C, right across from mine. She had boxes stacked around her feet, and she was just standing there holding a coffee mug looking at me, not in a friendly, "Hey, I'm your new neighbor" kind of way, but in this quiet, intense way that made me feel like I'd walked into the middle of something I didn't understand. I smiled, tried to be polite. "Hey, welcome to the building," I said. She nodded. Just a small movement of her head, nothing more. Her eyes stayed on me the whole time like she was studying something. I waited for her to say something back, introduce herself maybe, but she just took a sip of her coffee and kept watching. It was weird, but I figured maybe she was tired from moving. New place, new city, who knows what she was dealing with, so I just nodded back and headed to the elevator, feeling her eyes on my back the entire way down the hall. The next morning I had to run out early to meet a client. I grabbed my laptop bag, checked my phone for the time, and opened my door. And there she was again, leaning against the wall right outside her apartment, same coffee mug in her hand, same quiet stare. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual even though my heart did this weird skip thing. "Morning," she replied. Her voice was soft, almost distant. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The whole time I could feel her watching me, not looking away, not checking her phone, just watching. When the elevator doors finally opened, I stepped inside and turned around. She was still there, still watching until the doors closed between us. Okay, I thought. That's twice now. Maybe she's just observant. Maybe she's one of those people who notices everything around them. I tried to shake it off, but it kept happening. Every single time I left my apartment, she was there. Morning, afternoon, evening, didn't matter. I'd open my door and she'd be leaning against her doorframe or against the wall in the hallway, and those eyes would find me immediately. She wasn't aggressive about it, wasn't blocking my way or trying to talk to me. She was just there watching like I was the most interesting thing in the building. After a week of this, I started to feel uncomfortable. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. She wasn't doing anything wrong, technically. Standing in a hallway isn't a crime. Looking at someone isn't harassment. But there was something about the consistency of it, the way she was always positioned just right to see me, that started getting under my skin. I found myself checking the peephole before leaving my apartment. I'd put my eye up to that tiny glass circle and look out into the hallway, and more often than not, she'd be there waiting. Sometimes she'd be scrolling through her phone, but the moment my door started to open, her attention would shift to me. I tried changing my schedule. If I usually went out for coffee at 10 in the morning, I'd wait until 11. If I normally came back from my evening walk at 7, I'd come back at 8 instead. But somehow, no matter when I left or returned, she was there. It was like she could sense my movements through the walls. 2 weeks in, I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if she was awake across the hall, wondering if she was listening for my footsteps, wondering what she wanted, because that was the thing that bothered me most. She never asked for anything, never started a real conversation, never explained why she was always there. My work started suffering too. I'd sit at my computer trying to focus on a logo design or a website layout, but my mind would wander. I'd think about her standing in that hallway, and I'd lose my train of thought completely. Deadlines started slipping. Clients started asking if everything was okay, and I didn't know how to explain that my neighbor's habit of watching me was somehow taking over my entire life. One morning, I decided to try something different. I waited until what I thought was a random time, grabbed my keys, and quickly opened my door. She was there. But this time, she wasn't by her door. She was standing right in the middle of the hallway like she'd been walking past, and when my door opened, she stopped and turned to look at me. "Do you need something?" I asked. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I was tired and frustrated. She tilted her head slightly like she was considering the question. "No," she said simply. "Just heading out," but she didn't move. She just stood there, and we had this moment where we were both in the hallway, both frozen, both aware that something strange was happening but neither of us acknowledging it directly. I walked past her to the elevator, feeling my hands shake slightly as I pressed the button. Behind me, I heard her footsteps, and when I turned around, she was standing a few feet away, still watching me with that calm, unreadable expression. The elevator came, and I got in. She didn't follow. She just watched as the doors closed, and I could still see her face perfectly neutral until the last possible second. That afternoon, I decided I needed a break from my apartment. I grabbed my laptop and headed to a coffee shop a few blocks away, thinking that getting out of the building might help me clear my head. I found a quiet corner, ordered a large coffee, and opened my laptop to try to catch up on work. I was about 30 minutes into editing a project when I felt that familiar sensation. You know the one, where you can just tell someone's looking at you. I glanced up from my screen and my stomach dropped. She was there, sitting by the window, a sketchbook open in front of her, and her eyes were on me. This wasn't the building anymore. This was a random coffee shop in a city of thousands of people. And she was there. Our eyes met, and for a second I thought I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition maybe, or surprise that I'd noticed her, but then her expression smoothed out again, and she looked back down at her sketchbook like nothing had happened. I tried to focus on my work, but it was impossible. Every few minutes I'd glance up, and sometimes she'd be drawing, but other times she'd be looking at me. Just watching, just observing like I was part of her sketch. I packed up my laptop and left without finishing my coffee. As I walked out, I could feel her eyes following me through the window. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat on my couch staring at the wall that separated my apartment from hers and tried to figure out what to do. Should I report this to the building manager? But report what exactly? That my neighbor looks at me? That she goes to the same coffee shop I do? It all sounded ridiculous when I tried to put it into words. But it didn't feel ridiculous. It felt suffocating. Like my space was being invaded in a way I couldn't define or defend against. I felt watched, studied, observed like a specimen under a microscope. And the worst part was not knowing why. What did she want? What was she looking for when she stared at me like that? I barely slept that night. Every small sound made me think she was outside my door. Every creak of the building made me imagine her standing in the hallway, waiting for me to emerge. By morning, I'd made a decision. This couldn't continue. One way or another, I needed to understand what was happening, because the not knowing was eating me alive from the inside out. The next few days were some of the strangest of my life. I started documenting everything like I was gathering evidence for a case I couldn't quite define. Every time I saw her in the hallway, I'd note the time. Every time our paths crossed outside the building, I'd make a mental record. It sounds paranoid, and maybe it was, but I needed to know if I was imagining things or if this was really as bizarre as it felt. The pattern was undeniable. She was everywhere I was and always watching. I started avoiding my own home. I'd take long routes back from errands, hoping she'd get tired of waiting and go inside. I'd sit in the stairwell for 10 minutes before heading to my floor, trying to time it so she wouldn't be there. But it never worked. No matter what I did, she found her spot, leaned against that wall, and watched me with those calm, steady eyes. My friends started noticing something was off. I'd been declining invitations, making excuses about work being busy, but the truth was I just didn't have the energy for normal social interaction anymore. This thing with my neighbor was draining me in ways I couldn't explain. One of my buddies called me out on it. "You sound different, man," he said over the phone. "What's going on?" I wanted to tell him. I opened my mouth to explain about the woman across the hall, about the constant watching, about how I felt trapped in my own building. But when I tried to put it into words, it sounded stupid. "My neighbor looks at me sometimes," just didn't capture the weight of what I was experiencing. "Just work stress," I told him. I'll be fine, but I wasn't fine. I was getting worse. I stopped going to the rooftop terrace, which had been one of my favorite spots in the building. I'd discovered her there twice, sitting on a bench with a sketchbook. And even though the terrace was a shared space, the way she'd look up at me when I arrived made it feel like I was intruding on something. So I gave it up, added it to the growing list of places and routines I was abandoning because of her presence. The coffee shop was off limits now too. The grocery store on the corner became a gamble. I'd peek through the window first to see if she was inside. My world was shrinking and I was letting it happen because I didn't know how else to deal with the situation. 3 weeks into this nightmare, something shifted. I was coming home late one evening around 9 o'clock after forcing myself to go see a movie just to get out of my head for a few hours. I was tired, emotionally drained, and I just wanted to get into my apartment and sleep. I got off the elevator, turned the corner to my hallway, and there she was. But this time something was different. She wasn't leaning. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall between our apartments, and her head was in her hands. For the first time since she'd moved in, she wasn't watching me. I stopped walking. Part of me wanted to just slip into my apartment and pretend I hadn't seen her, but another part of me, the part that still believed in being a decent human being despite everything, couldn't just walk past someone who looked like they might be struggling. "Are you okay?" I asked, keeping my distance but making sure she could hear me. She looked up, and I saw something I hadn't seen before in her face. Vulnerability. Her eyes were red, like she'd been crying, and for a moment, she looked lost. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice cracked on the words. I should have left it there. Should have said okay and gone inside, but something made me stay. "You don't look fine," I said, softer this time. She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I know I've been weird," she said. And hearing her acknowledge it was like a shock to my system. "I know you've noticed." That was the understatement of the century, but I didn't say that. I just waited, giving her space to continue. "I don't really know how to explain it," she went on, pulling her knees up to her chest. "I'm not good with people. Never have been. And when I moved here, I was supposed to start fresh, be different, be normal. But I don't know how to do that." I leaned against the opposite wall, maintaining distance but showing I was listening. "Watching me doesn't seem like trying to be normal," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I know," she said quickly. "I know how it looks. But you're the first person in this building who actually seemed like—" She paused, searching for words. "Like someone who understood what it's like to be alone. And I guess I noticed you. The way you moved through the world so comfortably by yourself. I wanted to understand that." It was the most she'd ever said to me, and honestly, it just confused me more. "So you decided to stare at me constantly?" "I wasn't trying to make you uncomfortable," she said. And she actually sounded sorry. "I'm an artist. I observe people. It's what I do. But I realize now that I crossed a line, a big line. And I'm sorry." We sat there in that hallway for a long moment, silence stretching between us. Part of me wanted to accept the apology and move on. But another part of me was still angry, still unsettled by everything that had happened. "You were at my coffee shop," I said. "You were on the rooftop when I went there. That's not just observing someone in a shared hallway. That's following someone." She winced. "I know, and I don't have a good excuse for that. I got caught up in trying to understand you, and I didn't stop to think about how it would feel from your side. I was treating you like a subject instead of a person, and that was wrong." "Yeah," I said. "It was." She nodded, accepting that. "I can move out if you want. I know I've made you uncomfortable in your own home, and that's not fair to you. This is your space, and I invaded it." I thought about that. Having her gone would certainly solve the immediate problem, but something about the way she was sitting there, small and regretful, made me pause. She seemed genuinely sorry, and more than that, she seemed like someone who was struggling with something I could actually relate to. The loneliness, the difficulty connecting with people, the comfort of solitude that sometimes became a prison. "I don't want you to move out," I heard myself say, surprising us both. "But this has to stop, all of it. The watching, the following, the constant presence. If you want to talk to me, knock on my door and talk to me like a normal person. But I can't keep living like I'm being studied." "Deal," she said immediately. "I promise. No more watching. If I want to say something, I'll just say it." We both stood up, awkward in the way people are after an emotional conversation with someone they barely know. She moved toward her door, then paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "you're right to value your solitude. There's a strength in being comfortable alone. I saw that in you and I envied it. I'm alone a lot too, but I've never been comfortable with it the way you seem to be." She went inside, and I went into my apartment, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe properly. The conversation had been strange and uncomfortable, but at least now I understood. She wasn't some stalker with malicious intent. She was just someone who didn't know how to connect with people normally and had gone about it in completely the wrong way. That night, I actually slept. The days after our hallway conversation were different. She kept her promise. When I left my apartment, she wasn't there waiting. When I came home, the hallway was empty. It was exactly what I'd wanted, what I'd been desperate for, but weirdly it felt strange. I'd gotten so used to her presence that her absence was noticeable in its own way. About a week went by before I saw her again. I was taking out my trash and we ran into each other at the elevator. For a second there was this awkward tension, both of us remembering the weirdness that had come before, but then she just smiled, a small normal smile, and said, "Hey." "Hey," I replied. We rode down to the trash room in silence, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence from before. It was just two neighbors sharing an elevator. Nothing more, nothing less. When we got back to our floor, she went to her door and I went to mine, and that was it. Simple. Normal. The way it should have been from the start. But life has a funny way of not letting things stay simple. A few days later, there was a knock on my door in the evening. I opened it to find her standing there, holding a small canvas painting. She looked nervous, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Hi," she said. "I made something and I thought you should have it. If you want it, I mean. You can totally say no." I looked at the canvas. It was abstract, all these swirling colors and blues and grays that somehow captured a feeling I couldn't quite name. Loneliness maybe, but not in a sad way. More like peaceful solitude. "I made it thinking about what I saw in you," she explained quickly. Before I realized I was being creepy about it. "It's not a portrait or anything, just the feeling. I thought since I made you uncomfortable with all my watching, maybe you should at least get something out of it." I took the painting, studying it more closely. It was actually pretty good. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. "You're talented," she smiled, relieved. "Thanks. I'm trying to channel my weirdness into my work instead of inflicting it on my neighbors." I laughed. Actually laughed. And it felt good. That's probably a healthier approach. We stood there for a moment and then she said, "Would you want to grab coffee sometime?" Like actual coffee, where we both know we're going to the same place on purpose. I thought about it. The old me, the me from a month ago, would have said no immediately. Too much weirdness, too much history, too risky. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the apology or the painting or just the fact that I'd spent weeks being angry and isolated and I was tired of it. "Sure," I said. "Saturday morning?" "Saturday morning," she agreed, smiling wider. "I promise not to stare at you the entire time." "Appreciated," I said with a grin. Saturday came and we met at a different coffee shop, not the one where she'd watched me that day. Starting fresh seemed like a good idea. We ordered our drinks and sat down, and for the first few minutes it was a bit awkward. We were two people who'd started off on possibly the worst foot imaginable, trying to figure out how to have a normal conversation. But then she started talking about her art, and I found myself genuinely interested. She painted emotions, she explained, trying to capture feelings that people couldn't put into words. She struggled with social anxiety, had her whole life, and art was how she made sense of the world when direct interaction felt overwhelming. I told her about my work, about why I'd chosen to freelance and work alone. I talked about how I'd moved to the city 5 years ago after a rough breakup, how I'd built this quiet life for myself and found comfort in it, but maybe somewhere along the way, I'd built the walls a little too high. "That's what I saw," she said, stirring her coffee. "Someone who seemed content alone, but also maybe a little trapped in it. Like you'd forgotten how to let people in even when you might want to." It was uncomfortable hearing that, but it was also true. I had forgotten. Or maybe I'd chosen to forget because it was easier than risking getting hurt again. We talked for 2 hours that morning, and when we finally left the coffee shop, it didn't feel strange anymore. It felt like I'd made a friend, which was something I hadn't even realized I was missing. Over the next few weeks, we fell into an easy pattern. She'd knock on my door sometimes in the evening, and we'd sit on the rooftop terrace, the same place where her watching had once made me uncomfortable, and we'd just talk. About art, about work, about life. She introduced me to her art community, this group of creative people who met once a month to share their work and give each other feedback. I went to one of their meetings, feeling out of place at first among all these artists and their passionate discussions about color theory and emotional expression, but they were welcoming and they were interesting, and I realized I'd been missing this kind of connection. Not surface-level small talk, but real conversations with people who thought deeply about things. She started asking if she could sketch me sometimes, but now it was different. She'd ask permission first, explain what she was trying to capture, and show me the results. It wasn't creepy anymore because I was part of the process, not just an unknowing subject. "You were right to call me out," she told me one evening as we watched the sunset from the rooftop. "I needed someone to tell me I was crossing lines. I get so lost in my own head sometimes that I forget other people aren't just interesting images to study. And you were right about me," I admitted. "I was comfortable being alone, but I think I'd crossed into being isolated." "There's a difference," she nodded. "There is. Solitude is choosing to be alone and enjoying it. Isolation is being alone and forgetting how to be anything else." It was one of those moments of clarity that stick with you, where someone puts into words something you've been feeling but couldn't articulate. 3 months after the painting, after the coffee shop, after everything started to shift, she knocked on my door with an excited look on her face. "I got accepted into a gallery show," she said, practically bouncing. "They want to feature my series on urban isolation, and I was wondering if you'd want to come to the opening." "Of course," I said. "That's amazing, congratulations." The gallery opening was crowded, full of art people in interesting clothes having intense conversations. Her work was displayed on one wall, a series of paintings that captured different aspects of city life and loneliness. And there, in the center, was a larger piece that I recognized immediately. It was the feeling from that first painting she'd given me, but expanded, more complex. Blues and grays swirling with sudden bursts of warm colors, like connection breaking through isolation. "That's the piece that started it all," she said, coming to stand beside me, "the one inspired by watching you in those early days. I called it Honest Solitude." I stared at it, seeing myself reflected in those abstract swirls in a way that was both unsettling and beautiful. "It's incredible," I said. "You helped me understand something important," she said quietly. "That observation without connection is just voyeurism. But when you share what you see with someone, when you let them be part of the process, it becomes collaboration. It becomes relationship." Several people bought pieces from her that night, and I watched her glow with pride and excitement. This person who'd made me so uncomfortable months ago had become someone I genuinely cared about, someone whose success made me happy. As we left the gallery that night, walking back through the city streets toward our building, I realized how much my life had changed. I was still a freelance designer working mostly alone, still valued my quiet mornings and peaceful evenings, but now there was more dimension to it. I had a friend who understood me, a community I could tap into when I wanted it, and a comfort with being seen that I hadn't had before. "Thanks for not moving out," I said as we rode the elevator up to our floor. She laughed. "Thanks for not reporting me as a stalker." "Well, the thought did cross my mind," I admitted with a grin. We reached our doors, those 2 apartments that had been at the center of so much weirdness, and she paused before going inside. "You know what's funny? I moved here thinking I needed to be different, needed to force myself to be more social and outgoing. But what I actually needed was to find someone who understood that it's okay to be quiet, to need space, to connect in our own weird ways." "Same," I said. "I thought I had everything figured out, but I was just hiding. You showed me that even if your methods were questionable." She smiled. "My methods were terrible, but I'm glad something good came out of it." We said goodnight and went into our respective apartments, and I hung that first painting she'd given me on my wall, right where I could see it from my desk. A reminder of how things can transform, how discomfort can lead to growth, how the strangest beginnings can lead to the most meaningful connections. Life settled into something I never expected, a comfortable rhythm that included another person without suffocating my need for space. We'd have coffee on the rooftop some mornings, sit in companionable silence while working on our separate projects, and then go days without seeing each other, both of us respecting that need for solitude that had brought us together in the first place. But something was shifting inside me, something I didn't quite recognize at first. The walls I'd built around my life were still there, but they had a door now, and I found myself actually wanting to open it sometimes instead of just being forced to. I started reaching out to people I'd lost touch with. My younger brother, who I hadn't properly talked to in over a year, some old friends from before I'd moved to the city, relationships I'd let fade without really meaning to. It wasn't easy making those calls, and sending those messages felt awkward after so long. But every time I did it, I felt a little less trapped in my own patterns. My brother was surprised to hear from me. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice cautious like he was expecting bad news. "Yeah," I said and realized I meant it. "Everything's fine. I just realized I've been kind of distant and I wanted to fix that." We talked for an hour, catching up on his life, his job, his new apartment. It felt good, reconnecting with family, remembering that there were people out there who cared about me even when I disappeared into my own world. My neighbor noticed the change. "You seem different lately," she said one evening as we sat on the rooftop watching the city lights flicker on. "Lighter somehow. I feel different," I admitted. "You kind of forced me to look at my life at the way I was living. I thought I was content, but I was actually just avoiding things." "I'm sorry I had to be so weird about it," she said with a laugh. "Could have just knocked on your door and said, 'Hey, you seem lonely, want to talk about it?'" "Would I have let you in if you'd done that?" I asked, knowing the answer. "Probably not," she admitted. "You had that leave-me-alone energy radiating off you pretty strongly." She was working on a new series, she told me, about transformation and growth. She'd asked if I wanted to be part of it, but in a different way this time. Not as a subject she observed from distance, but as a collaborator. She wanted me to document my daily life through photography, while she created visual responses to what I captured. "It's about dialogue," she explained. "You show me how you see your world, and I show you how I interpret it. Either perspective is complete without the other." I agreed, intrigued by the idea. It would push me out of my comfort zone, make me look at my daily routines through a different lens, literally. I started carrying my camera everywhere, capturing moments I normally wouldn't have noticed. The way morning light hit my coffee cup, the empty elevator at odd hours, the view from my window at different times of day. Every week I'd show her what I'd captured and she'd spend time with the images, then create paintings in response. It was fascinating seeing my ordinary life transformed into her vibrant, emotional art. Things I found mundane became rich with meaning when filtered through her perspective. "You see structure and order," she said one day, looking at my photographs. "Everything in your images is balanced, composed, controlled. It's beautiful, but it's also safe." "And what's wrong with safe?" I asked, a bit defensive. "Nothing," she said quickly. "But look what happens when I respond to your safety with chaos." She showed me the painting she'd made, taking the rigid lines from my photograph and exploding them into swirls of color that still somehow maintained the essence of the original image. "Together, we're making something neither of us could make alone. Your structure gives my chaos direction. My chaos gives your structure life." It was a good metaphor for what was happening in my real life too. I was learning to let a little chaos in, to accept that not everything needed to be controlled and planned. And she was learning to respect boundaries, to channel her intense observation into productive collaboration rather than unsettling surveillance. The art community she'd introduced me to became a regular part of my life. I wasn't an artist like them, but they welcomed my designer's perspective and I found myself looking forward to their monthly meetings. There was this guy who did sculpture, turning discarded metal into beautiful abstract forms. A woman who wrote poetry that she performed with this raw emotional honesty that made me uncomfortable and moved at the same time. A photographer who captured urban decay in a way that made abandoned buildings look sacred. They were all people who'd found their own ways of dealing with the world, their own methods of connection and expression. Being around them reminded me that there wasn't just one right way to live, that my solitary lifestyle was valid, but so was their more communal approach. And maybe the healthiest thing was to exist somewhere in the middle. One evening, about 5 months into our collaboration, she showed me the completed series, 20 paintings, each one responding to my photographs, each one a conversation between her vision and mine. They were stunning, and more than that, they told a story. You could see the progression from isolation to connection, from rigid control to comfortable flexibility, from fear of being seen to acceptance of vulnerability. "I want to call it the door in the wall," she said, "because that's what this whole thing has been about, right? Finding that you can have your protected space but still create openings for connection." "I love that," I said, studying the paintings with a swirl of emotions I couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, that my simple photographs had inspired something so beautiful. Gratitude that this strange, uncomfortable situation had transformed into something meaningful. And something else. Something deeper that I wasn't ready to examine too closely. The gallery that had shown her previous work wanted to display this new series. They scheduled an opening for late spring, and she asked if I'd be comfortable with my photographs being displayed alongside her paintings, showing the full dialogue of our collaboration. It meant putting my work out there for public viewing and judgment, making myself visible in a way I'd avoided my entire adult life. My immediate instinct was to say no, to keep my part of the collaboration private. But I thought about those walls with doors, about the person I was trying to become, and I said yes. The weeks leading up to the show were intense. She was nervous, I was nervous, both of us wondering if people would understand what we were trying to say. We spent hours in the gallery helping to arrange the pieces, deciding how to position the photographs and paintings so the conversation between them was clear. "What if no one gets it?" she asked the night before the opening, standing in the middle of the gallery surrounded by our combined work. "Then we get it," I said. "That's enough." The opening was packed, more people than I expected, more attention than I was comfortable with. But as I watched viewers move through the space, stopping to look at a photograph and then its corresponding painting, reading the little cards we'd written explaining our process, I saw understanding dawn on their faces. They got it. They saw the dialogue, the transformation, the story of two isolated people finding connection without losing themselves. Several people approached me throughout the evening, asking about my photography, telling me how my images resonated with them. One woman said my photograph of an empty subway car at dawn perfectly captured how she felt most mornings, alone in a city of millions. A man said the sterile perfection of my architectural shots reminded him of his own need for order in a chaotic world. I was uncomfortable with the attention, but I didn't run from it. I stayed, talked to people, accepted their compliments and their questions. My neighbor watched from across the room, and when our eyes met, she smiled with something like pride. A local art magazine wanted to do a feature on the collaboration. A coffee table book publisher expressed interest in creating a larger collection. Suddenly, this thing that had started with such discomfort and confusion was becoming something real, something that existed beyond just the two of us. But the real impact wasn't in the external success. It was in what the process had done to me internally. I was still the same person who valued quiet and solitude, who needed space and routine to feel grounded. But I wasn't using those things to hide anymore. I was choosing them from a place of self-awareness rather than fear. I'd reconnected with my family, started dating again. Nothing serious, just putting myself out there. Accepted that being seen was scary but necessary. The collaboration had forced me to document my life, to look at my daily existence through a lens that made it art-worthy. And in doing so, I'd started actually living instead of just existing. "You know what's weird?" I said to her one night after the gallery show had closed and we were back on our familiar rooftop spot. 6 months ago, you were the most uncomfortable thing in my life. Now you're one of the most important people in it. "Same," she said. "You were supposed to be just another observation, another subject. But you became a mirror that showed me all the ways I was going about things wrong. And then you became a friend who helped me figure out how to do things right." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the city below us. Two people who'd found connection in the strangest way possible and somehow made it work. "I'm thinking about teaching a workshop," she said.